Brothers of the Serpent presents Göbekli Tepe, a treasure of the ancients. After many years of discussing this site and its enormous importance in changing how archaeology views ancient mankind, we finally were able to travel to Turkey to see it for ourselves. Seeing the site in person inevitably changes how you think about it, providing some answers and revealing many more questions. What do we know about the actual age of the site? Do we know how long it was in use? When was it abandoned? Was it really buried on purpose? And, like other sites in Peru and Egypt, for example, is it possible that Göbekli Tepe's origins might be far older than we have been told? In this video, we'll show you some of what we saw on our journey. We'll discuss what we learned and what we read in the scientific literature, and hopefully give you a glimpse into the minds of our ancestors.
Bordering the northern and eastern sides of the Harran Plain of southern Turkey are ranges of heavily eroded limestone hills. The tops of these hills are primarily exposed bedrock, with the slopes being lightly grassy and the valleys containing some gravelly soils. Despite being a poorly watered area, with mostly dry stream beds, some of these valleys support small farm plots of grains and the occasional winding orchard of olives, pistachios, or fig trees. Except for these small orchards, there is no woodland on these hills. About 15 kilometers northeast of Şanlıurfa, in the Taj Tepeler, meaning stone hills, the site of Göbekli Tepe sits upon the highest point of the Germuş mountain range, 770 meters above the Harran Plain. The mound, or tell, is distinct from its surroundings due to the enormous amount of deposited material that rises above what would otherwise be exposed bedrock. It is immediately obvious that the presence of the tell is odd. The locals have planted olive orchards there, and lush grasses paint the whole area a rich green color in spring, which stands out in stark contrast with the nearly bare rock hilltops of the surrounding area. Naturally, all of these hilltops are erosional rather than depositional environments, and yet this huge pile of material rises up 15 meters above the bedrock and covers an area 300 meters in diameter.
Upon closer inspection, the materials of the tell resemble Midden, which is basically ancient trash. Since we have had the opportunity to explore numerous Midden mounds in the Texas Hill Country, which also happens to be eroded limestone hills, the characteristics were familiar to us. But what is Midden, more specifically? According to Wikipedia, quote, "A midden, also kitchen midden or shell heap, is an old dump for domestic waste, which may consist of animal bone, human excrement, botanical material, mollusk shells, potsherds, lithics, especially debitage, and other artifacts and ecofacts associated with past human occupation. These features provide a useful resource for archaeologists who wish to study the diets and habits of past societies. Middens with damp, anaerobic conditions can even preserve organic remains in deposits as the debris of daily life is tossed on the pile. Each individual toss will contribute a different mix of materials, depending upon the activity associated with that particular toss. During the course of deposition, sedimentary material is deposited as well. Different mechanisms, from wind and water to animal digs, create a matrix, which can also be analyzed to provide seasonal and climatic information. In some middens, individual dumps of material can be discerned and analyzed." End quote.
The tell at Göbekli Tepe exhibits an abundance of worked flint flakes, broken bits of basalt grinding stones, bone fragments, and angular limestone cobbles in a reddish soil matrix. When we first saw the sheer size of this tell, within the context of the surrounding barren landscape, we could not help but question the intentionally buried narrative. It is hard to imagine a group of people first going to the immense effort to construct the enclosures, only to then bury them, which seems to us to be an even more laborious task than the construction itself. And after observing the fill material, which is actually midden, It seemed at first glance to be more like continuous occupation that ultimately buried this site. In the main excavation area on the southern slope, 4 monumental enclosures were discovered, each measuring 20 to 30 meters in diameter, with the famous T-shaped megaliths standing on the underlying bedrock in circular patterns around 2 larger central T-pillars that are over 5 meters in height.
Many great thinkers and scholars have published works speculating about the purpose of the site and analyzing the imagery and symbols. There is no shortage of ideas. Was Göbekli Tepe built for ritual practice, ceremony, or some sort of knowledge center? Was it a time capsule with a message for future civilizations? We have no idea, and so even though we do like to speculate about these things, the purpose of this video is to take a deep dive into the narrative that is developed about the site. We will review the literature and try to lay out the facts about what archaeology can tell us and what it cannot.
We have been told that Göbekli Tepe was intentionally buried. What does this even mean? It was definitely buried. It was definitely buried by people. Those people definitely intentionally brought materials to the site. However, this action happens at every occupation site that ever existed. Yet Göbekli Tepe is the only site about which we have ever heard this particular claim. It is never said about a Midden mound that the artifacts at the bottom of the mound were intentionally buried. Yet every Midden mound is made from people intentionally bringing material to the mound.
So what is the evidence for the claim that the people of Göbekli Tepe actually set out to bury the site? We'll get into the details in a moment, but first we must stress the point that archaeologists make certain claims in the literature based on data collected. Sometimes they will speculate on the meaning of the data in an interview or blog post. Finally, these data and remarks are reported by media in a way that is often simplified for public consumption. Without doing a fair bit of digging, this method of dissemination of information can cause one to easily come away with incorrect ideas. The website Tepe Telegrams is written and maintained by a multidisciplinary team of scientists as part of the Göbekli Tepe Culture and Karahan Tepe Excavations project. There is a lot of information on this site, and we recommend reading through it if you are interested in the archaeology of Göbekli Tepe and the related discoveries regarding early agriculture in the area. However, for the purposes of this video, we want to highlight a few facts from the Tepe Telegrams that we find particularly interesting. For example, in an article from May of 2019 titled "Cereals, Feasts, and Monuments at Göbekli Tepe," we read that there is evidence for annual bursts of food production in very large amounts, far more than would normally be expected in settlements of this size. Among other evidence for this surplus food production is the discovery of over 7,000 grinding tools, a number which the authors term as unusually large. These tools were used for processing cereal grains and minerals, as well as ochre, which was probably used to make a red dye or paint. The authors go on to hypothesize what they think this means. Quote, Göbekli Tepe's remote location on a barren mountain ridge is very unusual compared to the setting of contemporaneous Neolithic settlements, which are regularly located next to water sources. The construction of monumental architecture at Göbekli Tepe and other similar sites in its vicinity would have necessitated a workforce of hundreds of people, even by conservative estimates. One model to explain cooperation in small-scale communities involves ritualized work feasts. End quote. The phrase ritualized work feasts is then defined as events in which commensal hospitality is used to orchestrate voluntary collective labor. Most of us can recognize this custom taking place even today. If you've ever been asked to help a friend move to a new house in return for pizza and beer, you have participated in a ritualized work feast 10,000 years down the road from our ancestors at Göbekli Tepe. So it is possible that the site was built way up at the top of a hill far from any water source by means of annual work feasts involving a large group of people. But what were they building it for? The authors at Tepe Telegrams have a few interesting things to say about this as well. Quote, Göbekli Tepe has a high concentration of distinctive architecture, often addressed as special buildings, which do not repeat the characteristic plans of domestic buildings from contemporaneous settlements. Extensively excavated settlement sites like Navali Chori or Chayonu have one special building per settlement phase, while Göbekli Tepe has several, likely contemporary buildings of this type, which different groups of people likely used. For the buildings excavated so far, we have observed certain regularities governing the decoration of the 69 known pillars, mostly with animal motifs, but also with abstract signs. End quote. So, unlike other settlement sites, which have many domestic buildings and only one special building, think of an old church in the middle of a small village, for example, Göbekli Tepe has many special buildings, all of which seem to have been in use simultaneously. Also, each enclosure or special building at Göbekli Tepe seems to have its own specific animal symbols. Building A is the snake. Building B, the fox. Building C, the boar. Building D, the bird or vulture. Building H, the cat. The authors go on to say, we see these differences in figurative expression as evidence for different groups of people ornamenting the buildings with the emblematic animals central to their group identities. In addition, it is pointed out that out of the vast amount of artifacts of sculpture found at Göbekli Tepe, many of the animal and human depictions are clearly marked as male, and there are almost no clearly recognizable female depictions, a point which the authors say is contrary to what has been found at other sites. Unfortunately, on our trip in April of 2023, we weren't able to go to the museums to see these artifacts due to the flooding. Hopefully, we'll get to see these artifacts for ourselves on our next trip to Turkey. However, we were able to spend a lot of time at the monument sites, including Karahan and Göbekli Tepe, which allowed us to make some observations regarding the logistics and construction of the sites.
So let's consider the process of construction for a basic central enclosure. Although there is little to no natural sediment on the hilltops today, a 2019 study of the paleo-environmental conditions at Göbekli Tepe indicate that denser vegetation and a widespread sediment cover were present during its time of occupation. So to prepare the foundation for an enclosure, it is possible that the site had to first be excavated down to the bedrock. Depending on how deep the excavations were, retaining walls may have been needed to prevent sediment from falling or washing back into the excavation area. The bedrock was then flattened and leveled, leaving two low pedestals side by side in the center and a raised bench around the exterior. T-pillars were then cut from a nearby quarry, or perhaps some came from the bedrock of the enclosure. They were transported to the construction site, carved with high-relief imagery, and erected, or perhaps erected first and then carved. Into each central pedestal, a socket was cut in which the two larger central pillars would be fitted and held in place. The smaller T-pillars were erected surrounding the two larger central pillars and are apparently supported by a rock and mortar wall that surrounds the enclosure and covers three sides of the lower portion of each outer pillar. This wall is constructed of non-uniform, unhewn cobbles held together with mortar. The wall is said to have been covered in plaster. The whole structure would then have presumably been covered by some sort of timber and plaster roofing. We can't tell if the outer pillars were also socketed into the bedrock, since their bases are almost completely covered by the rock walls. But this is a key question. Were the outer pillars able to stand on their own? If so, it would seem that the rock wall is not part of the original design. In any case, it is evident that the sculptures and high-relief carvings on the outer T-pillars were completed prior to construction of the rock walls, since the rock walls cover up much of the carvings. This is also a point in favor of the idea that the rock walls are not original. Why would the builders go to all the trouble of carving detailed high-relief images only to immediately cover them up with a less sophisticated building technique? Also, the rock walls are load-bearing, and would support a roof structure just fine without the need of the outer megaliths. If carvings were desired, they could be done in the plaster of the walls. From a construction standpoint, the combination of rock walls and megaliths makes no sense here. If the plan is to build with megaliths that are socketed into the bedrock, then the walls are unnecessary. If instead the plan is to build walls, then the megaliths are unnecessary. What seems most plausible is that we are looking at two separate building phases. The original is rock-cut and megalithic with detailed high-relief carving, and the other is rudimentary rock and mortar construction with no evidence of artwork.
Another piece of evidence for this hypothesis is at Karahan Tepe. There is a large rock that appears to be a piece of an older worked stone, perhaps from a T-pillar, that has been reused in one of the rock walls. This stone stands out as very different from the normal rough cobbles used in the construction of the walls. We see this same method of repurposed materials all over Egypt and many other places. It is evidence that later peoples reused older materials for their own purposes.
Moving on to the archaeological work, we were very curious about the dating methods for the site, specifically the details that led to the conclusion that the enclosures were intentionally buried. This 2013 paper, published in Neolithics newsletter, gives us a basic description of the layering. Let's take a look.
The paper is titled, Establishing a Radiocarbon Sequence for Göbekli Tepe, State of Research and New Data, by Oliver Dietrich et al. Quote, the stratigraphy of Göbekli Tepe comprises 3 layers, an older layer 3 assigned to the PPNA or pre-pottery Neolithic A, a younger layer 2 attributed to the early and middle PPNB or pre-pottery Neolithic B, and a final layer 1, featuring mixed sediments derived from agricultural activities, though containing PPN materials and sporadic finds from the Middle Ages and the modern period, but with no architectural remains. Layer 3 has produced the well-known monumental architecture with megalithic T-shaped pillars arranged in circle-like enclosures around 2 taller central pillars. Layer 2 consists of smaller rectangular buildings, often containing just 2 or even 1 smaller pillar, and sometimes none at all. End quote.
It should be noted that the PPNA and PPNB are pre-established eras from the Levantine and Anatolian Neolithic cultures, and they are associated with particular styles of stone tools and arrowheads called lithics. These lithic styles are also found at Göbekli Tepe, so the layers 3 and 2 can be dated archaeologically relative to known periods associated with these lithics. It is the presence of these artifacts in the earliest level, layer 3, which provided the basis for the assumption that the builders of Göbekli Tepe were hunter-gatherers. Take a look at these flint points. Though beautiful and interesting, in our opinion, they are very rudimentary. This does not look like the work of a people capable of creating the high-relief carvings exhibited on the megaliths at Göbekli Tepe, not to mention the monumental architecture itself.
To illustrate how prominent the lithics are in the dating and overall narrative of the site, we pulled some quotes from a 2011 paper by Dietrich titled Radiocarbon Dating the First Temples of Mankind, Comments on 14C Dates from Göbekli Tepe. Dietrich writes, the oldest layer 3, which through the lithic finds comprising projectile points mainly of the Nimrik, Helwan, and Aswad types, can be dated to the PPNA.
And concerning layer 2, he states, the lithic finds, especially Byblos and a few Nivali-Chori type projectile points, place this stratum firmly in the early and middle PPNB.
And finally, the strata of Göbekli Tepe can be dated archaeologically without any problem. Also, rough estimates for the absolute time span of the layers can be deduced from radiocarbon dated sites, which show a comparable lithic assemblage.
Again, since the monumental architecture is built directly upon the bedrock and not on top of any pre-existing midden, This data at best tells us that the people that made these lithics occupied the site of Göbekli Tepe after the megalithic construction was completed. It does not tell us who constructed it or when the construction work took place. As far as we can tell from the literature, the best method of absolute dating of Göbekli Tepe came from plaster used in the construction of the rock walls.
In his 2013 paper, Dietrich writes, quote, "This wall plaster comprises loam, which also contains small amounts of organic material. A sample taken from the wall plaster of enclosure D gives a date of 9,745 to 9,314 BC at the 95.4% confidence level, thus placing the circle in the PPNA." End quote.
Again, this does not date the megalithic architecture. At best, it gives us a date for the construction of these rudimentary rock walls that could have been built by later people, perhaps attempting to restore an already ancient and dilapidated megalithic structure.
We also found this really interesting fact about the history of the site in the 2011 paper by Dietrich. Quote, "As a major later intrusion into the site, a big pit feature in enclosure C should be mentioned. The pit is aimed directly at the central pillars, which were destroyed, the fragments left nearby. It seems that this intrusion was a planned iconoclastic action, which took place sometime after the abandonment of the site." End quote. A carbon date from this so-called looter's pit places it roughly at 5 to 6,000 BC. So that would mean that 4 to 5,000 years after the site was buried and hidden, some group of people came along and specifically targeted these two central pillars, excavated and destroyed them, and then filled in the pit. Why? How did they know it was there? Is it possible that they learned from their own legends that a great relic of the ancients was hidden here? We will likely never know the answers to these questions, but it is fascinating to imagine the possibilities. Now let's look at the evidence for the intentional burial of the site. In his 2013 paper, Dietrich writes, quote, "At least for the large enclosures from Layer 3, it can be stated that these were intentionally backfilled at the end of their use lives. This backfilling poses severe problems for the dating of this layer using the radiocarbon method." End quote.
The reason for this is that much of the backfill material may have come from a pre-existing midden pile. As stated before, a midden pile builds up slowly over time, and the layers contain materials that can be dated, possibly spanning many thousands of years. So if you dig up a midden pile and throw the excavated materials into a pit, then the youngest layers will end up at the bottom, with the older layers at the top. And none of the dating would necessarily be connected to the age of the pit. In his 2011 paper, Dietrich states that the backfill material consists mainly of approximately fist-sized limestones mixed with flint artifacts and animal bones, which can be clearly recognized as leftovers from meals. And that the quantity of animal bones far surpasses the amount which would be anticipated in a settlement. This fact led archaeologists to hypothesize that huge feasts took place at the site, possibly to support a large workforce for construction or for ritual purposes. Dietrich also writes that the sections of enclosure D lead to the impression that the stone circle was perhaps set into an already existing tell. So these observations ultimately led to the idea that a midden mound was excavated down to the bedrock in order to build the enclosure. The excavated materials were thrown into an older enclosure, along with the refuse from massive feasts that were taking place during the building and burial, and that this process of building, feasting, and burying was repeated from one enclosure to the next. As to the radiocarbon dates from the fill materials, Dietrich states that they cannot fix the enclosures themselves chronologically.
Having no reliable carbon dates from the fill materials, archaeologists tried to date the architecture directly using pedogenic carbonates, a mineral deposit that forms on limestone over time after it is buried. Though this method also proved unsatisfactory for the absolute dating of the site, it did provide some interesting data from Layer 2. When two samples from the upper and lower parts of Pillar 11 were tested, the dates were roughly 1,500 years apart, suggesting that the upper part of the pillar remained exposed for over 1,000 years after the lower portion had been buried. So the claim that this part of the site was intentionally buried by the builders cannot be true. Apparently, the burial occurred in phases throughout a period of over 1,000 years.
And if it is true that the Midden was excavated in the deep past, as Dietrich suggested, it may have been done after the megaliths were already partially buried by human occupation, because the oldest rock walls are dated to the beginning of the PPNA. It seems to us that a likely timeline for this site is that the megaliths were built first and then abandoned. Later, the PPNA people occupied the site, did some restoration work, and generated the Midden, which later collapsed into the enclosures. Of course, this timeline pushes the construction of the megaliths deeper into the mists of prehistory. At the very least, the narrative of intentional burial should be questioned. It is unfortunate that the idea has been portrayed simply as a single action by the builders, rather than a complex process occurring in multiple stages over nearly 1,000 years and spanning two archaeologically and culturally distinct eras.
With only about 10% of Göbekli Tepe having been excavated and studied, and still many more similar sites around Turkey yet to be excavated, there is still much to uncover and much to learn before the story of these mysterious builders can be told with any certainty. I hope all of you enjoyed this video. We plan on making more content like this. Kyle actually started working on this on the plane on the way back from Turkey, and it has taken us a while to get this video out, but we're going to get better at it, and we are going to make many more like this. So I hope you all enjoyed it, and I want to thank Ben from Uncharted X. He's been an inspiration for us. He makes videos like this, and they're excellent, and yeah, he really has inspired us, and of course we've been traveling with him, so thanks to Ben, and also thanks to all of you who have supported the show, and I hope you enjoy this new direction that we're going to take some of our content. Thank you guys.